All right, everyone. Well, thank you for joining today's Lunch and Learn on the Knoxville Climate Council. We'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully folks will continue to kind of trickle in. But again, just wanted to welcome you all on behalf of the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, and thank you for joining us today to learn a little bit more about the Knoxville's Climate Council and receive some updates. My name is Brady Watson, and I am the Civic Engagement Coordinator for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. And for those of you not familiar with our organization, we are a nonprofit organization that promotes responsible energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are a membership organization, and we would like to acknowledge our members that are on the call and encourage those of you who are not members to please join us today if you'd like. For ways in which you can become a member and get involved, please visit our website at cleanenergy.org. And now I'd just like to take a couple moments to review the basic functions of the Zoom platform on the bottom of your screen. To ensure sound quality, all attendee lines will be muted throughout this presentation. And if you have any trouble hearing or seeing the slides, just click that chat button at the bottom and type in your problem, and the host will be able to help you troubleshoot. We've also saved time at the end of the presentation to answer questions about today's webinar. And if you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A button, also along the bottom of your screen, which is next to the chat feature. And so you can do that as well. Lastly, we are recording this webinar, and we'll send you, we can send along a recording afterwards with key action steps we addressed during the webinar. And with that, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we can start with the presentation. So yes, again, thank you all for joining us. Today we're glad to be joined by our Executive Director, Dr. Stephen A. Smith, and Brian Blackmon with the City of Knoxville's Sustainability Director. Again, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy is a regional organization with members that are promoting responsible energy choices to ensure safe and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. One of our campaigns focused here in Tennessee is the Renew Tennessee campaign. And we're really focused on lowering utility bills for Tennesseans most in need, increasing access to renewable energy like solar, and trying to put the public back in public power with increased transparency and public participation in decision making. These are the two gentlemen I mentioned that will be joining us today. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Steve. Steve, I think you might still be muted.
Oh, sorry. Hey, okay, here we go. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'm excited to be here, and I appreciate everybody joining us. Let me just first say that we're obviously in unprecedented times, and there's a lot of obviously serious health concerns, and there's a lot of work that's going on where people are putting themselves on the front lines, and we just really appreciate all that our frontline healthcare workers and first responders and everything are doing. And so we're sensitive to what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic. But obviously, we've got to keep moving forward on a lot of things. And so one of the things that the pandemic has really done for us is really emphasize the need for good science and also good planning, and the role that government can play in looking forward and using science and decision making. So this really links back to the work that we're talking about here with trying to continue to grow the progress that Knoxville and our state has made on looking at issues around climate change. So the first thing we need to acknowledge is that there has been a steady drumbeat of activities around making progress on climate change, going all the way back to the Haslam administration when he was mayor, the Energy and Sustainability Task Force. We worked with a number of others there, and the good work was done to start to evaluate and really get a handle on what the emissions were in Knoxville. Obviously, the Knoxville getting designated a Solar American City designation in 2008, the Smart City Partnership, the Extreme Energy Makeover. All these things, as you can see in this timeline, were very important in making progress. And this next step is going to be building on the shoulders of the good work that's already been done. Next slide. And so this is just a little bit of some of the groundwork that's been done around the energy savings with the the Knoxville Extreme Energy Makeover, the important work that was done in converting not only our streetlights, but our stoplights and other things, great savings there. The fact that, starting back in the stimulus package, Knoxville was working on EV charging stations, and now is got a movement into electrifying transportation more broadly with electric buses that are under contract to be purchased, and I think 6 are actually in the queue now. And then we've seen growth in solar, but obviously we want to see more growth there. We want to see more demonstration both locally and then ways that we can partnership on solar. Next slide. So basically, just to make sure we're all level set on sort of where we've been and where we're going, starting back in the 2007, 2008 timeframe, the city set a goal to get approximately 20% below 2005 levels by 2020. And a lot of the early work that was done was to properly inventory and understand the dimension of this, and then find those real efforts that could move quickly and cost effectively to meet or exceed that goal. And Mayor Rojero's administration did a great job of working through that, and actually met and did exceed a little bit the 2020 goals of having a 20% reduction. It was important that the Rojero administration set the bar and worked with the city council to actually set goals going forward so that there is continuity between administrations. And so we have the 50% reduction goal by 2030 for city government. And then we have the broader, more ambitious goal of 80% community-wide reduction by 2020. So why don't we take the next slide and we'll sort of drill into that a little bit more. So this is the actual narrative that describes the goals, and people can see it on their screen. Basically, greenhouse gas emissions 20% by 2020 in both municipal operations and community as a whole. That was the sort of original goal. And then the city council has adopted, and the mayor is committed to, the new mayor, Mayor Kincannon, has committed to meeting or exceeding this target, which is the municipal greenhouse goals, about 50% by 2030, and the Knoxville community emission goals, 80% by 2050 relative to the 2005 baseline. Now, let's be real, the push for community-wide emissions goals is going to be a bigger challenge. And this is where all of you who are on this webinar and all of you who have your networks, and one of the most important roles that I think SACE and other partners we have in the advocacy community, we've really got to get the whole community behind this, because the city can go so far, but we've got to have this broader commitment from individuals leaning into this goal and really making it happen. I hope that we can actually exceed this, because my read of the climate science says that we need to be moving even faster. But I think this is a good place to be at this moment with these targets. And it is my hope, and I would ask everyone that is knowledgeable about these things and supportive of the climate reductions, is that we continue to think big and ambitious about what we can do, and that these are floors, they're not ceilings, and that hopefully we can meet and exceed these goals in a more accelerated timeline going forward. But this gives us good targets to be moving towards, and I think the science demands it. And hopefully, as I said earlier, coming out of, if there is a silver lining in this COVID pandemic, it's that it has helped us relearn what we need to do about planning and proactive actions. Next slide. So we wanted to just give a few examples of sort of where we stack up with some other, cities in our region. And you can see that a number of cities have municipal goals. Ours are somewhat more ambitious than some of those in the near term, which I think is a positive. And then others also have the community-wide goal, and ours are, somewhat in alignment with what we're seeing there. Orlando's a little more aggressive, but we're, so we're sort of on par. But this gives you a sense on some of the larger areas, and then there's just a whole cluster of smaller municipalities and local governments in Florida that are setting targets also. But this gives you at least a sense of kind of where we stack up from a regional perspective. Next slide. So again, I am very bullish on where we are. We, as an organization, and a number of you who are on this webinar, worked hard to make sure that we elected a mayor that was deeply committed to climate change. Indya Kincannon made some, very bold commitments as a candidate, and she is now moving forward, even in light of the COVID struggle that's really putting a lot of pressure on local governments. The fact that, and Brian's going to lay this out for us in a little more detail, that we're actually seeing very positive direct movement by this administration to follow through on the commitments she made as mayor. I think that is a very positive sign, and we're very proud to have been a strong supporter of hers to get this going. And we all need to, all kinds of politicians make all kinds of promises, and it's up to the citizens to hold them accountable. But I think we're in a good place right now, and we're looking forward to what Brian's going to share about the development of the Mayor's Climate Council. So we're excited about that. We still have some concerns about what TVA is doing, and believe that TVA could be providing more leadership. And we, as you know, through some of our work with Renew Tennessee, we continue to keep the pressure on there. We are also pleased that Knoxville is moving forward on some larger commitments to renewable energy, but we believe that there's even more that can be done there. There's a lot more that can be done on energy efficiency. There's a lot more on rate design that can be done by KUB. So we'll continue to, be proactive in that. And then all of us need to not only be working with the mayor, but we need to be in touch with our city council and making sure that we are thanking those council members that continue to provide leadership and support these goals and support these initiatives, and that we maintain the ability to keep in touch with the Climate Council moving forward. Next slide. All right, so I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Brian, and look forward to the Q&A.
Yeah, and just a reminder for folks, please enter questions if you have any into the Q&A box, and either Brian or Steve can answer those later. Yeah, take it away, Brian. Thank you.
Great. So I'm situating my camera. I've got a little bit of a rig here going on. So thanks, Brian Blackmon. I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Knoxville. I see a lot of familiar names on the participant list. I've been with the office since 2014. I'm in a little bit of a new role in the Kincannon administration for those that have worked with me. For those of you that haven't worked with me, I was previously the project manager, and I was the team member that worked on compiling the greenhouse gas inventories for the City of Knoxville. And we're in the process of wrapping up our 2019 inventory right now, and we'll be putting some information about that online very soon, probably within the next couple of weeks. So for those of you that aren't familiar with our office, the way that we approach sustainability is using a practice that I call internally, at least, tactical problem solving. We're a small, scrappy office. We don't have a lot of funds. So we work with teams of internal and external partners to achieve our results. And what we really focus on is making sure that we're providing high quality information and then convening the appropriate stakeholders since we know that we may not have the bandwidth to be able to execute, or we may not even have the agency or ability to see some of these things through to fruition. So in a lot of ways, we're reliant on our community partners, and that's why I'm excited to share some details about Mayor Kincannon's Climate Council and that process with the members and participants on the call today. So if this is your first time hearing about it, or you've had concerns about whether this would be a commitment that we would see through, if you heard the mayor's State of the City video from this last week, she reaffirmed that we're committed to the Climate Council and we're committed to addressing community greenhouse gas reductions across municipal and the community. So we're committed to this process. And the first meeting will actually be on the afternoon of May 12th, and we'll start at 1 p.m. and it'll be a virtual meeting. We're working on some of those details, but it'll be a format similar to this. And what we're going to discuss over the course of this is really mitigation strategies. I've heard some feedback from members of the council, and then we've heard feedback from the community members about adaptation strategies. Where we've decided to start in this process is really discussing mitigation. So what are the activities that we're going to need to reduce emissions? And 80% by 2050 is a big ask. We're definitely up to the challenge, but we're talking a lot of community trends that are not necessarily looking the best, and they're going to take some drastic changes in investments, not just that we make, but we're asking our institutional partners to come to the table. So among those, obviously SACE is going to be a member of the table. We'll be putting out a full list here soon, but since TVA and KUB were specifically mentioned, they have agreed to be a part of this process. So they will be voices at the table, and they'll be a part of coming up with solutions that benefit all of our residents. So when we're thinking about these strategies that are being identified, we're really talking about community focusing on this climate council. We've heard a little bit of feedback from folks about, what are we going to do for municipal? Well, there'll certainly be strategies that come up that are related to municipal operations. In a lot of ways, those are easier to implement for us. When it comes to municipal operations, that's a budgetary line item. We can put the request together. We can, go to the plate and fight for what we need. And we've done a pretty good job of that. To pull back the curtain a little bit on the 2019 results, which we'll have posted online on our sustainability page in the next couple of weeks. What we're seeing is we're actually down approximately 30% from a 2005 baseline. And we've been able to do that without sacrificing level of services. That's including CAP, that's including expansion of transit routes, that's including faster services, that's including expansion of recycling. All these things factor into that. And we're able to do that through a mix of adopting higher efficiency equipment like LED street lights or more fuel efficient vehicles, and then obviously benefit from lower carbon electricity coming into our service territory, through KUB and TVA. But when we're thinking about these community-wide impacts, it's not as pretty of a picture. So again, kind of pulling back that curtain a little bit, emissions related to buildings have improved about 23% across residential, commercial, and industrial. But transportation's actually gotten worse by about 44%, despite better fuel economy. So these are going to be some of the large issues that we start discussing with the Climate Council, and we need to sit down and talk about that science. We need to talk about what the data and trends really show. I'm not in the camp that we need to dress it up to show the best possible picture. There's definitely some nuance and context that our council and the public need to be aware of. And one of those is whenever we're thinking about transportation, we've actually seen an increase in the amount of vehicles traveling in roads in Knoxville. Fuel efficiency is better across the board, and we've seen emissions go down per vehicle mile traveled. But a higher volume of vehicles is going to drive that up unless we're a zero emission transition. And it's not as simple as, one person saying, well, we should just all go electric. We've got to consider some of these community impacts and cost impacts. How do we deploy equipment? Is that a public or private sort of entity? And really dive in the weeds. So that's why it's so important for us to convene folks that have a good understanding of multiple sectors and can identify some community impacts or implementation concerns early. Mayor Kincannon's Climate Council is going to be comprised of cross-cutting community leaders and institutional partners. And they're going to be tasked with helping identify and prioritize strategies to address these complex community-wide activities that drive our emissions up. The council itself will meet bi-monthly to learn, share, and discuss emission impacts from the community and identify some fairly broad strategies. And we've broken these into sector-based conversations. So the buckets in which we're discussing this are transportation, buildings and energy, and waste. The council is going to assist the city in identifying those challenges and opportunities. And what we're trying to do is keep a compact time frame to discuss these mitigation, because it's important for us to get a lot of information and feedback to the city and city departments early as everyone's thinking about upcoming budget cycles. We didn't want to delay with coronavirus and everything happening. We did push ourselves back a couple of weeks, but our time frame still looks very optimistic for being able to get a lot of information before those budget submissions happen, even if we won't have a published plan or updated work plan at the time. It's most important to get that information to the decision makers and make sure that they're aware of it. And so one of the things that this council will start, they're going to start at a very high level. We're going to discuss these strategies. And I've already heard a little bit of concern from some of our partners about where do we get involved. And one of the key parts for this is taking those broad suggestions, those high level points of feedback about community concerns or potential opportunities or challenges for a specific strategy, and taking that to technical working groups and being able to parse through the fine details to actually come up with a recommendation that will be high quality and nuanced and has all the perspectives of the practical implementation partners. And we'll take those actions and we'll bring them back to the council at subsequent meetings, and they'll discuss them, and we'll keep that loop going. So the initial mitigation discussion will happen over roughly the next year, and it will both inform and update our work plan and the community focuses for the city's sustainability work. And one of the ways that you all can get involved, we're going to start a page that'll be dedicated to the Mayor's Climate Council. We will be posting meeting notes, presentations, upcoming meetings, meeting information, and then we'll also have ways that you can get involved, whether it's a survey to give some feedback. We'll have kind of an ongoing poster feedback, give some thoughts, and we'll be taking this in and providing that perspective as one of our duties as the city convening these stakeholders and making sure that we're representing the voices and opinions of those in our community. And before I ramble too much about the nuance, I'm sure people might have questions about emissions or this process. I'll turn it over to Q&A so we can get to any of those concerns.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.
The first one we have, you've touched on briefly, but just wanted to clarify where the city was in meeting the 2020 goal.
Mm-hmm. The city has met and exceeded the 2020 goal for municipal operations. It has not met it for community. So we're still fine-tuning the numbers, so it's likely to change. So in 2012, we had seen about a 13% reduction in community emissions and a 12% in 2015. And we're finalizing the numbers for 2019, and we actually expect it might be on par with 05. It looks like a slight reduction right now, a little over 1%. And a lot of that is due to the increase in vehicle miles traveled in those recent years. So, like I said, building emissions on the community scale have actually gone down about 23%. And per VMT has gone down on the community, but total vehicle miles traveled is what's driving that up.
Great, thank you. And again, just a reminder to folks, please submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get those answered by Brian or Steve. Next question, are there official benchmarks for progress for the 2050 community-wide goal?
Yeah, so, we've taken a rough percentage. So our target is 852,686 metric tons of CO2e for the community. That's what we would need to hit to get an 80% off of our 2005 baseline. And in 2015, we were at, we'll say, a shade under 4 million. There's 3.99 million metric tons.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
There was another comment, wanted to, you said interesting report on the baseline data, and wanted to thank you for making sure that that data was shared with the public and accurate. So thank you for doing that. And again, you mentioned this briefly as well, but could you go in a little bit more detail about which sectors will be represented on the Climate Council, and if you have any more of a list yet, other than the folks you mentioned?
Yeah, let me pull up the list. So we're still working through some confirmation. We're trying to make sure that we don't oversaturate in one particular sector. So we've got some neighborhood perspectives. So we'll have community member, at least one represented. The chamber will be represented. UT administration will be represented. KUB, TVA will be represented. SACE will have student representation. We'll have some business representation, and SEED, socially equal, energy efficient development. So that workforce perspective. And then we're discussing some labor representation too. We just don't have that confirmed yet. And we're looking for faith-based, and we've had some discussions. We just haven't had a chance to confirm those names yet.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Another question, how can we interact more with residents who are not necessarily tuned into environmental issues, such as climate change, to influence behavior? It seems there are many people in the Knoxville area who are unaware or don't care.
That's a tough question. I don't know that I have a clear answer. That'll be one of the things that I'm sure comes up through this process, or ways that we can better engage residents to make them aware. We've done targeted campaigns and workshops in communities, I would say to varying success. Overall, they're really well received, but we would obviously love to have more people in the room. We struggle with people's times, what they do in the evening, how do we make it relevant? So we're actively looking for opportunities, but a lot of times it has to be very targeted and to a very specific need. It's easier to get people in the room to discuss how they can save some money on their utility bill, or how they reduce those impacts, than it is to talk about maybe like adaptation or stormwater strategies. Although over the past 2 years, I think more people are getting tuned into the emergent need of how climate change is affecting flooding in an urban environment, and how it's affecting their ability to get to work, or even their property.
Yeah, and I would say that I think this is one of the areas where the advocacy community is, got to step up more, to where we're going to be doing more, community engagement directly on these topics. And once we can identify, we need to amplify what the city's been doing, and I think doing that in a more proactive and aggressive way. And so I think that's where it truly becomes a community effort, because you can only go so far with local governments. At some point, the community has to engage, and so there's going to need to be a sort of a balanced partnership between nonprofits, the private industry, and also the local governments to really, step that up. And so I think we're going to have to be thinking creatively about, how do we design, education campaigns, and then how do we sort of really put a spotlight on where there's leadership, and then maybe there are, businesses. I mean, some of this VMT, one of the things coming out of the COVID thing is we're all learning a lot more about telecommuting. And so maybe there's a much more intentional way where we're asking local businesses to really help prioritize telecommuting, so that people aren't going using their vehicles as much. And so there may be, again, some learning or some relearning that we can do And I think we need to figure out creative ways to tell that story and then reward and, sort of thank and spotlight those businesses and community leaders that are actually setting examples, to where hopefully that will make it a little bit of social peer pressure to do the right thing.
Great, thank you both for that. Next question, along the lines of telecommuting and reducing VMT, to reduce transportation emissions, what are the chances of cooperation between city and county in expanding bus routes so commuting into town from the county can move away from cars?
I think we're open to that. I mean, that's something we've actively discussed with CAT. The KTA is actually set up in such a way that it could be a regional transportation. It just takes an alignment of the county being interested. There's a certain degree of cost for expansion of service, and that has to be met from somewhere. But yeah, it's something that regularly comes up, and we're actively looking at how do we support that.
Great, thank you. Is the city willing to hire an independent expert to work with the Climate Council in formulating the comprehensive climate action plan?
Yeah, we're working through contracting right now with a consultant to help with facilitation. We really wanted to make sure that this was an impartial process. So we're bringing in an outside consultant to kind of manage the conversation. That way the city can be at the front of the room and a part of the conversation, but it won't feel as though we're driving it or trying to put it in a particular way. We wanted to have a third party come in and do that. Since we don't have names on the line right now, I can't say who that is, but we will be bringing in a consultant to do facilitation and run the meetings.
Great, that's good to hear. Thank you so much. Let's see. Next one is, what did KUB do regarding TVA's demand for the 20-year contract, and what is the city's position about TVA's lack of solar and wind energy in its energy mix?
Okay, so the question about the contract, we're supportive of it because I think it opens up a lot of opportunities that weren't available for investment in solar. You see that with the dividends and how KUB has allocated the funds. Buying 200 plus megawatts of production. They're investing in weatherization programming with that dividend, and they're planning to actually do some work for people that are on weatherization assistance waiting lists as well. So I think there's a lot of good that's coming out of it. And in regards to the entire process and their evaluation, I can't speak to all those nuts and bolts for KUB. And then what was the other question was about solar? Was that?
Yeah, basically TVA's energy mix and their lack of solar and wind.
Yeah, I think they're making a lot of progress in that. It's slow coming, but you're talking utility grade investments, and their review process for sites takes a long time, but they've been hearing it from the private industry for a while now, and obviously the advocacy industry. And the Green Invest model, for folks that aren't familiar with it, but that was essentially a private model that they had the Facebooks and these people coming in with huge data centers that also had 100% renewable goals, and they said, we just want to buy it. We want our center to be 100% renewable, and we just want to cut a check for it. And it was so successful that TVA took that model and repackaged it, and that's their Green Invest, and that's what KUB is actually investing in to get their 200 megawatts. So all in, I mean, I think there's some progress. Could the investment be greater? I think obviously, and I also think that the investment from private industries has kind of opened up some doors for all users in a way that doesn't affect rates, because it puts it under power purchase agreements and doesn't involve the direct investment from TVA and require them to own that asset for a long period of time. And I think that's kind of a prudent approach that we hadn't been hearing was an option for a while, and I'm glad that they're embracing it, and I'm glad that we're seeing it because we saw it in surrounding states like South Carolina, which is where I grew up. We see a lot of PPAs showing up.
Yeah, I'll chime in on that a little bit. We are obviously supportive of KUB taking action to invest more in solar. We are not big fans of the 20-year contract because we actually see it over the course of the 20-year life being more constrictive. And we're actually publishing a blog today about the whole sort of misinformation about the 5% flexibility and the fact that that's actually significantly lower than what has been represented by TVA. We, as a regional organization, can see where leadership is happening by the large utilities across the Southeast, and TVA is not in that leadership bracket with their commitment to particularly solar power. They're more on the laggard side because for their size, they should be much further along. You can see North Carolina, you know, is multiple times, 6-7 times where TVA is. Florida, Georgia, and even South Carolina is actually catching up to TVA quite fast. And so with TVA being such a large entity, we would expect a lot more. And so we're frustrated by that. And we believe that there needs to be a better alignment of TVA setting goals instead of only being, you know, sort of brought to the table by private industry to actually do something, because the price points for solar now and why a lot of these PPAs are actually going forward is they're actually competitive now with fossil fuels and where they haven't been in the past. And what TVA, because TVA doesn't have the same level of independent regulatory oversight where you can actually see things like avoided costs and everything in a regulatory proceeding, TVA is a self-regulated federal monopoly that does not provide transparency at the level that we see with a lot of the other investor-owned utilities in the surrounding area. We do not have a clear understanding of what TVA's true avoided costs are, and we're somewhat dependent on them to sort of communicate that at some level. And we believe that that's being gamed somewhat so that we're not seeing the level of solar development and even the potential for additional wind development that could be going on in the valley. So we think there's still work that needs to be done. And unfortunately, KUB, we believe, moved too quickly in signing this contract. We have a number of debates, particularly going on in Memphis right now, about whether the large local power company in Memphis, is called Memphis Light, Gas, and Water, even stays on the TVA system. And they may actually either leave the TVA system, which is going to have some repercussions through the whole system, or they may negotiate a different contract with TVA potentially that, you know, it may have been shrewd for KUB to wait a little while on. So we were advocating for KUB to take a little bit of a go or slower approach. They could have invested in Green Invest if they wanted to. They could have done a lot of things. They didn't have to sign a 20-year evergreen contract. So I believe that there's still work to be done there. The good news is that we are not, the city is not, citizens are not totally dependent on KUB. There are ways to do transactions behind the meter, independent of, to some degree, of KUB, if they make economic sense and if they help advance the goals. So I think KUB is an important piece of the puzzle, but we should not feel like they are the rate limiting step, that we have to get their approval on everything, because I think the city has the ability to enter into independent contracts and provide local solar that brings local jobs and local economic development and actually gets to be flagship for what the city wants to do. Whereas the stuff that KUB just signed up for is going to be developed in West Tennessee and down in Mississippi, which is great because, again, that's important. We want to see those solar developments, but we also want to see local government leading by example and actually having some of these flagship facilities demonstrating that this technology works and making sure that we're getting local jobs as opposed to the jobs being developed down in Mississippi. So, you know, there's a lot of pros and cons here, and there's a lot of nuance, but I think these are all, you know, sort of steps generally in the right direction when we're seeing some additional solar coming on. But when we look at the size and the scale of what we need to do, we've got a lot more work. And again, I think KUB is not leading at the level we would like to see them lead, but hopefully by getting them at the table and getting them to see the commitment that local government and the community has, they're going to line up and start to work more proactively with us.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to folks, please, if you have questions, enter them in the Q&A feature on the bottom of your window, and we'll get those answered. I just wanted to throw this out there. This was a comment. I just want to express gratitude for the city's leadership and commitment to actually doing something about this looming climate threat. That includes both elected officials and staff members. It makes me proud to be a part of this community. So I thought that was a nice sentiment. The next one is the city has set the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. And they wanted to know basically what factors these three things are being considered as part of that. One is tree planting, one is transportation and housing policies, and then a couple for building emissions. One is, can residential construction be more efficient in both the construction and energy efficiency phase after the family moves in? And then the other one was, can we achieve net zero carbon in all buildings by 2050 if we set that goal today and phase in higher standards incrementally? So I know that's a lot, so I can repeat it if you need me. But.
I'll try to work through them from the top here. So on, I think trees was the first one in terms of how we were considering it. And so
yes,
one of the ways that we've incorporated preservation of trees, and obviously we're a built environment, we're a highly urban environment. It's a difficult balance, but with the recode, we actually instituted some landscaping to include a certain amount of trees. So we have tree requirements. Our inspectors are looking for trees. We're keeping an eye on them. They're not, a lot of our codes inspectors may not be arborists, so they may not know about the health of the tree. It's a very nuanced discussion. Whenever we think about emissions, we currently, they're a part of the carbon environment due to storage. We currently do not reflect those in our inventory. So we also currently do not reflect RECs or renewable energy credits in our inventory. We try to present as true a picture as we can of what the usage is in municipal and community operations. So that's one thing to keep in mind there. Trees are something that we value, and we try to look for ways to protect them and make sure that we have a healthy, robust urban canopy for a number of reasons, not just carbon sequestration, but also for thinking about heat island effect, but stormwater mitigation. There's a lot of things that go into why we value trees, but we don't reflect them in our carbon. Green building policies and codes, that's an essential part of any sort of building discussion that we're going to have as a part of the Climate Council. We're above the state minimum, and so typically between code cycles you might see somewhere in the ballpark of like 1.5%, maybe 2% increase in efficiency. And so we're on 2018 code suite right now, which means that we're well above the state. We've actually consulted with a couple of other cities that are talking about how we got that adopted and some resistance from the builders community, but we're enforcing it. It's in. We're monitoring stretch codes. North Carolina had a regional collective that passed some stretch codes. We've been looking for something a little bit uniform with a little bit more data around it, and we've participated in some regional efforts to advise the ICC code cycle to look for some greater increases in efficiency that also wouldn't upset or increase building cost a great degree, dollars per square foot sort of thing, rather than double digits. And transportation and housing policies, we already do that. So whenever we have an affordable housing investment that the city makes, we're already looking for either opportunities that are close to a route or making sure that we're tying that in with CAT services. That's a priority for us to make sure that whatever we're building, especially with density and affordability in mind, that it's well connected and livable as well. And then there was a question about the net zero carbon.
By 2050, yes.
Yeah. I think that's something that we'll be actively discussing for the Climate Council. That's on the radar of this stretch code. What do we need to think about in terms of identifying that standard? The reality is there are going to be uses in an urban environment where net zero carbon may not be achievable with a direct investment on that premises, and we need to talk through some of those constraints. You may not be able to meet all your needs through a rooftop solar, or you may not have adjacent properties, and so we need to discuss those priorities and what sort of cost impacts there may be, and then the best possible way for us to achieve that. I think it's twofold. We need to be pushing from our utility partners to see greater investments in renewables, because that's something that impacts all ratepayers. And for those that can't afford to make that investment, or you're a first-time home buyer or home builder, and you're taking out a pretty sizable mortgage already, and you're thinking about incorporating renewables in that, it increases your cost. It makes it a hard ask. It's something that we need to have at the forefront of our minds whenever we think about these sorts of investments. And investments by the utility inherently affect everyone. We reap the same benefit from a 30-something% lower carbon per megawatt hour from TVA, as does every other single house in our community. So from a city perspective, we want to advocate for a lower carbon supply to all houses from the utility, rather than forcing investments. But the reality is, on a time frame, we're probably going to have to push for both and look for ways to incentivize both. That way we can accelerate those impacts, and taking care of some of that on a site-by-site basis where people can possibly afford that sort of cost, obviously makes that investment from the utility a little bit smaller and makes that move a little bit quicker too. So I think it's twofold in that sort of strategy.
Great, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep.
One thing you kind of touched on, and I think you mentioned RECODE. I think this is part of it, but could all multifamily housing, for instance, be required to be located within walking distance of transit lines?
In terms of required, I think from a practical aspect, it already occurs. I think on the county, it gets a little bit trickier, where you have multifamily housing going and we don't have connectivity, or right there on the edges where we might have some limited transit service. It becomes a definition of how connected it is, and is it within a block, because the likelihood of us having something on every block may not be a feasible solution, at least like an overnight solution. But yeah, I mean, it kind of works out that way already in practice throughout the majority of the city. And the closer you get to the county, it gets a little bit more sparse, and that is primarily due to just lack of connectivity and low ridership, and it's hard to justify the sort of rate recoupment that you would expect on another otherwise more popular, more saturated route. But yeah, I think that's a valid point. I'm sure that's going to come up during the transportation discussions, and thinking about how we define connectivity and what our standard or threshold for success should be in defining that sort of connectivity. And I think that those are fair criticisms, and that's the sort of thing that we need to hash out as a community and determine, is it worth the financial investment to expand services in either route frequency or getting to within a certain block or within a certain range.
Great, thank you. Let's see, this is a question from a local solar owner, but as the owner of a local company involved in solar and energy efficiency, I've been involved with the TVA Green Power Provider Program, TVA Keen Program, and the TVA More Program. In my experience, for the community to be involved, there needs to be an incentive. And this person was asking, does the city have a plan to incentivize energy efficiency or solar to maximize community participation? And Steve, I was thinking it might make sense for you to talk a little bit about what TVA has done with its residential solar program and how that affects KB too.
Yeah, I'll kick it over to Steve, because I'm sure he's going to have some good insights and some good opinions there. But generally, no, we don't have a plan for any sort of incentive. We're a mid-sized city in the Southeast. We don't have a ton of money. My budget for my office is relatively small. We typically don't provide incentives for any sort of program related to energy efficiency. We get grant funds periodically. We participate in these federal programs that come down, but we don't have a plan. I'm sure that's something that's going to come up in terms of if we want to see this sort of investment. What's the best way for us to see private investment in renewables or energy efficiency? And those are going to be things that for sure we need to discuss with the Climate Council, and they're on the list of practices that we've heard about and that we anticipate coming up as part of this process.
Yeah, no, it's an important question. TVA, I as a Knoxville resident put solar on my home in 2009, and was one of the first people to do it. And TVA had a very generous program to help incentivize that. Solar costs were much higher then, and so sort of as an early adopter. Over time, as the solar costs came down, TVA began to sort of walk back the incentives, which at some level made sense to a point. We felt like, and we thought we had an agreement with TVA that they would stop at what was sort of a net metering kind of parity. TVA has a buy all sell all agreement where they have dual meters, so technically it's not net metering, but they should be giving the same retail rate for solar that people who have solar on their house produce, and people can usually make the economics work if they have a fair rate like that. But unfortunately, TVA has become very hostile to rooftop solar and has largely killed that program. They have taken the buyback that they're willing to pay for solar generation below retail, which has further damaged the economics for customers. And they've come up with these arguments that it doesn't have value to them, which we have been in the room with them and demonstrated very clearly. We went through a very deliberate process with them about how you score those values. And while we didn't totally reach consensus, there was a pretty clear understanding that paying retail was not out of bounds, but they continue to sort of want to put their thumb on the residential and small business solar, which has unfortunately caused a lot of hardship and led to a number of solar companies either having to drastically constrict themselves or go out of business altogether because again, TVA doesn't pay what we consider as a fair rate. On the energy efficiency side, again, the story was there was a period back, 2015 timeframe where TVA was making larger commitments, and they were actually running programs that were geared at commercial and residential to try to do things that made sense. Obviously, the Keene program came out of they were dinged in a lawsuit over their coal-fired power plants, and they had a $50 million requirement coming out of EPA to do that, and they directed about $15 million of that towards Knoxville. But once that money ran out, and TVA decided that they didn't want to promote energy efficiency anymore, they pretty much pulled way back on any sort of programs around energy efficiency. And I think they've virtually taken that budget from what was approximately $100 million annually to less than $10 million annually for programs that are doing true conservation and energy efficiency. Now they've come up with new ways of defining that, where they consider efficient load building, actually part of their quote unquote efficiency, but it's actually not helping people lower their bills and save money in the way that a traditional conservation and efficiency program would do. And so I think we're in this awkward space right now where, TVA has certain things that they're willing to discuss and do, but a lot of the kind of workhorse things that we think could add value and particularly help with local governments, TVA is not a full-throated and partner on things like efficiency and things like local renewables and sort of working with customer-owned renewables, solar power. So that's really unfortunate. The good news is that can change because you have a different administration, you get rid of some of the leadership at TVA, you get a new board of directors, and or there's a clear signal where all of a sudden this country is going to take this more serious. TVA could be a living laboratory for doing a lot of really innovative things. Unfortunately, this current cast of characters that's running TVA right now doesn't really embrace that. And so I've got enough gray hair to have seen, people cycle through TVA and see TVA actually, be a leader on some things and then be a laggard. So I still maintain some hope that we may actually see some change in leadership and actually see TVA really doing a more aggressive partnering with local governments to meet these goals going forward. But right now, the programs are pretty anemic, and I think we need to continue to advocate for more and try to hold TVA accountable and make TVA more of a full partner with what local governments and citizens are trying to do their part to be part of the solution instead of being part of the problem.
And
Great.
Just to chime in briefly, I know that TVA did kill a lot of their generic programs for energy efficiency. They have stepped up in a big way, I think, with Knoxville, and making sure that the work that kind of in that same vein of team continues to happen on some level throughout the Valley communities. So I'm very pleased to see that sort of leadership. But again, yeah, the loss of the general incentive, I think that's the biggest thing for uptake. When we had the EV incentives, the federal incentives, and some state administered, you saw a lot of people looking to buy a Leaf. Those went away. People stopped buying it. It's the same for these small upgrades. What's the trip point that gets you from a 14 seer to 16 or higher seer? If there's a check on the table for a couple $100 or something like that, you may be more inclined to eat that cost and pick up the difference.
Yeah, it's it's interesting, and we if you to us, there's sort of the verbal kind of rhetorical discussion in leadership, but what really matters is when you put serious money on the table. And so TVA's current program, which they call Uplift, where they put $500,000 or $1 million out to some of the larger urban areas, and they they do a big PR. They get a lot of green eyewash type of PR about it. But all of us know that, particularly with the heavy energy burdens that a lot of low, moderate income people face, TVA brags a lot about quote unquote low rates, but the reality is we have very high bills in the TVA service territory, and those bills are obviously the rate times consumption plus all these fees that they add on to it, and that leads to these high energy burdens. And so in order to really get a handle on helping in an equity way low and moderate income, and then being able to really injecting some funds into some of these low income programs, you have to do more. TVA is a $10 billion plus entity. For them to write a $500,000 check or something, it's chump change to them. And so when they had a $100 million program across the Valley, that's getting in the right order of magnitude. When they drop that kind of program to less than $10 million, you can just see that it's a rhetorical commitment. I mean, I know from y'all's perspective, Brian, that anything is valuable and helpful, but it's just really not serious right now by TVA. And so when they were putting $15 million into Knoxville, you saw some serious things starting to happen. When you're doing this fraction of that, it's just much harder. So we look forward to the day where TVA really becomes a full-throated partner and run to make these things move forward.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, just I wanted to acknowledge we just have a minute or two left. We have one more quick question and maybe a comment. But I know, Brian, I saw this in the city budget, but there was a $50,000 for a sustainable innovation fund. Could you briefly touch on what that is?
Yeah, so that's an allocation to our office to look for some of these less than 10-year, ideally like a 3 to 5 year payback investments in city facilities. So whenever we go and renovate, we maybe do a partial renovation of a building, and we may not touch the entirety of the building. So just as an example, Cal Johnson Rec Center, we went in, we updated, we're making it more of a community amenity than it was. The information or the parts of the building that we touch, we bring that to a very high standard. So whenever we're talking about adding a new air handler to it, we're putting in a high SEER air handler. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're
we're touching the other older air handlers in that building. So this fund is really to look for projects like that and find whenever we go touch a building, what else can we do to make sure that we're treating it as a whole building. And for year one in particular, one of the things that we're looking at is training a bunch of staff on energy management cross-departmentally, and making sure that we've got a ton of eyes thinking about the same thing. Historically, we've got good people that work really hard and they look for things that they can. Whenever I approach it from a sustainability perspective, my threshold for what I think might be a good investment might have a little bit higher of a risk tolerance than what they're typically thinking about and what they're hearing. So we want to get them trained on what to look for, how to come up with some of the calculations that we look at for payback, net present value, how to evaluate some of these projects, what are some of the low-hanging fruit, what are some of the intermediate fruit. And that way, whenever something comes up, like one of these projects, on the back end, our office might get engaged to kind of evaluate and say, what, based on what we're doing, how does it stack up sustainably? And I'm like, oh yeah, it looks great, but what's going on in the rest of the building? And so this is meant to kind of fill that gap and make sure that whenever we're thinking about renovation projects in particular, that we're also thinking about ways to make showcase projects. It won't be entirely limited to that, but that's roughly the basis of that program.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. I just had one more comment. Some folks mentioned that it would be helpful to have architects as part of the Climate Council, so I wanted to throw that out there. And then lastly, I wanted to thank everyone for joining today. And as a last kind of call out to you all, we'd love to hear your ideas for in ways to engage the community. If you all have unique ideas for ways that we can reach out to the community as part of this process, just go ahead and plug them in the chat box, and we'll compile those because we really believe that community engagement is going to be important for this process. But otherwise, I think that's about all we have. I don't know if you wanted to say anything to wrap up, Steve, but
well, the only thing I would say is we're honored to be asked to have a seat at the table on the council, and we take that very serious. And so we are very eager for everyone to be in touch with us about how we can help connect with the community in better ways, and how we can help make sure that people are staying engaged. And so we look forward to helping be a conduit. Obviously, these are going to be open sort of fishbowl type of processes, I believe. And I think particularly the technical work groups are going to have even more sort of level of involvement. So there's going to be multiple ways to do it. But, we as an organization are going to take very serious our role. And so as Brady mentioned, please communicate with us about how we can help keep you as members of the community informed, and how we can think creatively about sort of bringing more people in the community in, because again, we can only go so far with what the city can do, but it's really going to have to be all the community leaning in to hit these goals. And so we're committed to think creatively and outside the box about how to sort of get more and more people involved. So we're eager to hear from people about that.
Great. Yeah, thank you all. And if you please stay tuned for future events, we'll hope to keep this kind of engagement process going. And thank you so much for joining us, Brian. That's all I have if you had anything else to add. Otherwise, thank you all for joining.
Thank you all.